Right, it's 2 o'clock and welcome everyone. It just doesn't feel the same not being face to face. What, Jen, is there, am I coming through okay? Or are you? Okay, it's just not the same not being face to face in these open forum budget updates that we've been having the last year and a half, 2 years. I've really enjoyed it, seeing the group of all of you out there in person and being able to see you. I guess I can see you in little Hollywood Square things right now. And this is the best we're going to have to do. But thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is our initial 2021, fiscal year 2021-22 budget open forum, our official kickoff. Jen Steele, our budget officer and assistant vice president, is going to be joining me and doing part of the presentation with me. We're going to give you an overview of where we are right now with the budget process as we move into the spring and in setting our budget. And then we will answer any questions you have. So thank you again for joining us. One other thing, Jenny Larimer is here in her, I don't know if it's an official role anymore, Jenny, as moderator, chief moderator, but she's here as a moderator, and it will be handling this like all the other town halls where you can type your questions in or signal her with questions you may have, and she'll either read it or we'll let you ask the question. But thank you, Jenny, for assisting us in this today. So let's put the slides up. So we have been going through a process that's going to be a multi-year process of moving from the way we used to do budgets, which we had done the same way pretty much for the last several decades, to a new way, which hopefully will be more nimble. It will give us, give the senior leadership and leadership of the university at all levels a better way to make decisions for strategic investments. And unfortunately, we can't just wave a magic wand and drop a new process in and be done with it. This is going to take time. Jen has been leading a committee of representatives from across the campus in helping to frame where we're going for the future, decisions that we have to make. Those will then eventually go to Leadership Council to be vetted, and then eventually to Admin Council. But where are we at today? A year ago, we shared with you that in a more classical sense or ideal sense, when building a budget for a university, you go through steps to identify what your revenue projection is for next year. And then you go through steps to identify your expense projections. And then the difference, sometimes there's more money and that's available for strategic investments. Sometimes there's not enough money, and that informs your decision on if you ask the legislature for more money, which, chances are they won't give us. And that's not a comment on our current legislature, that's just the nature of the game, or the environment. Or we then say, oh, well, maybe we need a 1% tuition increase or a 5% tuition increase. So it informs that process. Certainly you can come back and say, oh, we have to cut expenses. But hopefully after the work we did last year to set us on a path of a balanced budget, we'll be able to be much more strategic in how we invest our money rather than being strategic in how do we reduce our expenditures. So with that, let's look at revenues for a moment. We start with enrollment management and the work that Stacy Phelan and her group and Lynn Reddington have been doing. They actually project what our enrollments will be by next year. And in an ideal world, we'll be wanting to do this by credit hours, by student type, and down to a very granular level. But prior to the last year or so, this is something that really had not been undertaken in a very strategic, intentional way in the past. And under Stacy's leadership, we are at the point now where at least we're projecting headcount and looking at res, non-res, grad, undergrad. And so it's a huge, huge first step in moving us forward to link the enrollment management office to the budget office. In the past, when the revenues were looked at for the fall, it was the budget office kind of looked at a number totally independent of enrollment management. So thank you to Jen and Stacy for working together and moving this process forward. So with that, we now know what the enrollment target is for next fall. And then that goes through a model in which we then build a revenue projection for tuition and fees. The second component is what comes through the legislature or the state board. And at this point in time, we know what the governor's budget recommended budget is. There's no guarantee that that will get passed. And certainly in the legislative or in the legislative process, there's always a give and take between the governor and the legislature before we finally find out what our state appropriation is. But we have a good idea of at least the starting point. And then finally, there's other revenues that we have. And then we put those together, or that estimate together, through looking at trends, having the UBOs talk to, or us and Jen talking to the UBOs about what's happening in housing, what's happening in dining, what's happening in these other areas. And so they build a forecast. So we take all three of those pieces, and that gives us what our revenue projection is for next fall. This is the first time well, I've only been here a little over 2 years, or 2 years this month, but since I've been here, and I understand it's the first time in many, many, many years that we've actually had a solid data-driven revenue projection in January prior to starting this process. So this is a major step forward in going to a new budget model. We then take a look at the expense side of the equation. Another first is it's taken us 1.5 years, but through the help of human resources and the help of the UBOs, and then maybe some others of you who are out there, we now have a position list that only includes positions that were in the budget and that are authorized. Now, they may be a vacant position, but it's a true position that ties to our budget. So we no longer have a number of PCNs hanging out there with balances in them that people can move around. And so this was one of the first things we needed to do or change to start to get our arms around what is our salary and benefit expense. It's 75% of what we spend. And so in the past, that was, again, not as tight as it should have been in terms of being able to give us data to make decisions. So we now have the position list. We now know what the recommended CEC is, so we could put that into play if possible to now determine what our salaries are. We then go back to the UBOs and we go back to Angie Dobbins' financial analysis area and look at trends. We talk to the units to determine what the irregular wages are going to be. We get information from the state benefit office on what our fringe rate or what the rates for benefits will be. So we calculate our fringe rate. And then we also look at trends for other expenses. So prior to doing any budget work, at this point in time, we know what our revenue target is next fall, and we know what our expense target is. And so that is an excellent starting place to be so that we can have the leadership council focus on truly how do we build a budget for next year. So anyway, we have that. Let's go to the next slide, Jen. So if we look at the far right column, the FY22 projection, the exercise that we just completed, we're projecting $279 million for revenue next year. expenses of 282.7. That says we're $3.7 million overspent, if you will, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. If we look at 21, if you recall, we went through a very difficult process last spring to eliminate our structural deficit. Even though we show a $2.8 million deficit in the budget, we instituted actions that won't take place until 22 that actually balance our budget. So we have a balanced budget to start with. We now move back to FY22. If we look at the revenue, it's 279 million. If we look at what the revenue was in 2019, it was 280. It dipped to 277 in 20 and 275 in 21. This really highlights the issues we're having with enrollment, or I shouldn't say the issue, the challenges that we're having with enrollment. And we are addressing those, but I truly believe that our projection is really based on sound logic and data for the 279. So why do we have a $3.7 million deficit before we go in the year? Well, the first is our enrollment in 21 was less than what we had projected. And so we have a lower base when we had originally projected out to 22. And then we're also assuming all vacant positions are filled. And we know historically that's not the case. We have a turnover, just like any other university, just like any other business. Somebody leaves today, it may take us 3 months to fill the job. It may take us 3 days. It may take us the whole year. We typically save around $4 to $6 million a year through that turnover process, or just through turnover and attrition. So to start with the 3.7, that would be assuming all of our vacant positions are filled on July 1 and we don't lose anybody next year. So don't panic when you see this 3.7. I would much rather be in a position where that was 0, and then we know that we have probably 3.7 that we can invest into something else, but I don't want you to panic when you see the 3.7. Let's go to the next slide, Jen. So what do we do with this knowledge as we go into the budget setting process? Well, the first thing we know is, as I told you, we typically are $4 to $6 million, have $4 to $6 million in savings, salary savings through turnover. In the current fiscal year, 100% of that was swept from the units and it went to a central account. And that's what helped us and is helping us to balance our budget this year, so that we can respond. So we were able to respond to the 5% or $5 million budget rescission that we had. So what we are proposing is next year, rather than sweeping 100% of that, we would sweep 50% and let the units keep 50%. And then that would give us 2.6 million of the 3.7. And there may be some additional salary savings that we could use, or other savings for $1 million. So essentially we'll be starting the budget process in a neutral position. And then we will be looking at initiatives that may be generated by the units that we'll have to identify where the revenue comes from to pay for those, or why we would invest in these initiatives. So it's an incremental process to change our budget methodology, and it's an incremental process to solving the budget problem fiscal issues that we were having. And we're in pretty good shape going into this year. Jen?
Okay, so with that framing, the guidance that we're providing to units as you're embarking on developing your budget plans for fiscal year 22 is that you're empowered to work within your existing base budget, and on your local and special appropriation and auxiliary funds, you're empowered to develop expense budgets equal to your revenue forecast for the year. And then, as Glenn mentioned, in December, Admin Council approved a recommendation from our Budget Model Advisory Group that for fiscal year 22, we will implement a salary savings split on appropriated positions, and that will help offset that initial deficit. So units will have access to 50% of any salary savings after you've budgeted out your full position list. We do not yet have base funding for strategic initiatives. That's certainly a goal that we're working towards in our new budget model. And as Glenn mentioned, there is an opportunity for units to request strategic investments in excess of their base budgets. Those will be considered by Leadership Council and referred to Admin Council. And because there is no funding base for those, the opportunities will be limited, but we will certainly consider those and try and fund ones that align with our strategic priorities as an institution. All budget plans and proposals will be presented to Leadership Council in April, similar to the presentations that were done last year. And then the budget will be approved by Admin Council by early May. And we have a detailed timeline and other information posted on the budget website. We just want to highlight a couple of key dates coming up. We have another forum scheduled for February 16th. And at that time, Glenn will be able to provide any updates that we've gotten as far as the state budget and any additional information about our forecasts for next year. We will be having public tuition and fee hearings on February 16th and 17th. And although we will not be considering any increases to base undergraduate tuition, Leadership Council will be discussing tuition and fee rates next week, and they will be looking at possible changes or increases to the graduate fee, the non-resident fee, professional fees, and the EISU fee. Budget materials from the units are due to the budget office in March, early March. And then, as I said, we'll have the presentations in early April to Leadership Council. And with that, we would like to open it up for any questions or comments. And Jenny can tell us how you'd like to facilitate that.
Thanks, Jen. So yes, absolutely. You can either just ask the question, take yourself off mute and ask, or you can type it publicly, or you can send it directly to me and I'll ask it anonymously. So we don't have any questions yet, but while we're waiting for those to come in, I would like to ask a question. How can we best support you and your efforts at this point? What should we be doing related to morale, day-to-day? How can we assist?
It's a great question, Jenny. I think, each one of us has ideas. Each one of you have ideas of what goes on in your unit, what could be done better, what are new ideas, and just share those with your local leadership team. You may come up with an idea that will increase our enrollments, that may save some, or may give us an opportunity for implementing an efficiency initiative. But I think just being involved with thinking of your own areas, your own small business, and what could be done differently to better serve our customers, to support our faculty, to support your fellow staff. Those would be some things we can do. I think from a morale standpoint, the fact that we're out from under this long-term structural deficit is something to remind yourself of, or to remind each other of, that as we go into the budget setting process this year, we don't have this big cloud over our head. Yes, we're operating in I was going to say post-COVID. We're not quite to post-COVID yet, but we're operating in this COVID environment, which is totally different than where we've been before. And yes, it's given us challenges, but we're not staring at a 5, 6, 7% reduction. And just try to remind yourself and your colleagues of where we've been as an institution, and really look to where we're trying to go in the future. Because as we get this budget model developed and implemented, it's going to give each of your departments, your organizations, your colleges, and the university as a whole more options for making strategic investments. So I would try to focus on where we're going and the fact that we don't have this looming structural deficit budget cloud over our heads.
Excellent. Thanks, Glenn. Next question. Is there any room in the budget for raises, or are things still too tight?
Typically, the money for raises come from an increase in state appropriation. And that comes through the legislative process. So we won't be creating, and we're not allowed, I don't believe, by DFM or the Department of Human Resources of the state to institute our own raise plan outside of what they put in place, even for non-classified individuals. So you need to stay tuned on that one. We'll see what happens at the legislature. But when we do get pay adjustments, it's normally part of the CEC process that comes out of the legislative process.
Great, thanks. Next question. Have there been any savings from working at home? Just curious.
The biggest savings, and I don't know the numbers, and I don't know if Cheryl Hansen's on here right now or not, but I have been told that our utilities expense has been significantly lower than what it has historically been. So there are some savings in that regard. We definitely, not necessarily from work from home, but because of the pandemic, our travel expenses are way down this year compared to other years. But then the work from home, may create some other expenses as well. So overall, yes, there's been a savings. I don't know how much it's been. It's probably something we should look into at some point, but again, we've been forward looking and are just trying to get through each day and solve our adjustments to the new way of working up to this point. Jen, you don't have any information on that, do you? Okay.
Excellent. Next question. Will this year's budget process intersect with this year's program health process?
Yes, it will. And I'll let Jen talk about that because she's been more involved than I have.
So the timing for the program health recommendations, it's really going to impact the fiscal year 2023 budget cycle. So the final reports, I believe, are due later in the spring, after your 22 budget plans are due. However, to the extent that you have recommendations that have emerged through your program health review process, and those are ready to move forward, you can address them in two ways through the 22 planning process. You can reallocate within your existing budget to support issues and opportunities that arose out of your program health analysis. You could also request strategic investments for items that arose that are not able to be supported within your base budget. And then that's what will happen for 22. The majority, I think, of recommendations that come out of this process will really inform our budget for fiscal year 2023 and subsequent years.
Thanks, Jen. Next question. What are some examples of strategic investments? What have we done in the past?
Jen, do you want to throw out a few that we did last year or for this year?
Sure. So for this year, a couple of the strategic investments that were supported were an investment in our marketing campaign. Also, there were program expansions within the health professions. So those proposals involved additional revenue and expenses. And we also invested in additional GA ships for the graduate school. Those are a few examples.
Great, thanks, Jen. Next question, is overhead share change still planned?
Could you read that again, Jenny?
Sure. Is overhead share change still planned?
Is this in relation to the indirect cost return for PIs?
Will I give this person a chance to clarify the question? Oh, yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. That's currently there is a presidential charter to look at indirect cost recovery, and there is a group of individuals that's being led by the Vice President for Research, Donna Liebecker, who is looking at this. And the idea would be that there would be a recommendation to come to some sort of consistent way of distributing and handling the indirect cost return. I don't have any more information on it at this point, other than there is a presidential charter to come up with a process recommendation.
Great, thank you. Next question, isn't this current legislative session considering a 2% CEC?
The governor's budget has recommended that the 2% CEC that was in place or passed in the last budget that was then held back. They're recommending that goes forward, and also that there's a 2% CEC for the next fiscal year. One thing to keep in mind when they talk about 2% CEC, that 2% is based on our appropriated salaries. So the actual dollars available may be less than 2%. It's 2% of our appropriated salaries, not 2% of our entire salary base. And so last year, there was a 2% CEC, but there was an agreement between the state board, the presidents of our universities, and the Department of Human Resources and DFM, that we could take the dollars that were allocated, which were based on a 2% CEC, and spread those across our employee base, which would have equated to about a 1 or 1.25% pool. But we were not able to implement that because of the rescissions and the holdbacks that took place.
Great, thanks, Glenn. That's the last question that I'm seeing right now. Unless any come in the next few seconds, I'd love to turn it back to you and Jen for any closing remarks or anything else you'd like to share.
Well, thank you for everyone for taking time to attend this town hall. We'll be doing more of these throughout the budget process, and also to give an update on the financial situation in the current year in the coming months. And we just wanted to kick this off to let everyone know that we've started the budget process. Our plans for a new process and new timeline is working. And we're just excited to share that news with you, and then to continue answering any questions that you all may have. So if nothing else came in, well, thank you for your time this afternoon.